great. So let's start. Thanks everyone for coming to UX Oxford. So this is the first event of the year, but we do have events every month. So before we start, I'd like to thank our lovely sponsors, which are local to Oxford, Oxford Computer Consultants, Heybrook, and Fruto. And I also would like to thank the other organizers, Finola, Rachel, and James. So this month we invited Carmen, who is actually my colleague at Fruto, and she's a UX designer at Fruto, and is going to be talking about colors in UI design. I've heard the talk before, and I've learned something from it, so I hope you learned something from it as well. So I'll hand over to Carmen. And by the way, sorry, as we're switching, we're going to have questions, a little bit of time for questions at the end. So yeah, at the time it just adds to the chat at the end. But yeah, it's over to you, Carmen.
Great, let me share my screen. I wonder if, I think it's this, oh, here we go. Can you see my screen okay?
Yeah.
All right, perfect. I'm gonna see if I can minimize you. Okay, great. Oops. Okay, so yeah, welcome everyone to this talk on the practical creation and application of a UI color palette. So my name is Carmen, and I'm a UX designer, and I work at Fruto. I've been working at Fruto for over 2 years now. And even though we all do a bit of UX and UI and everything, I do specialize in UI, and it's the area that I enjoy the most. And I have quite a bit of experience in creating and applying color palettes for a wide range of projects and clients. So with that said, it keeps giving me, oh, there we go. Yeah, so with that said, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the goal for this talk. So this goal seeks to provide insights on the roles that color plays in UI, as well as provide an effective and efficient way of creating and applying a UI color palette. So basically what it's going to try to do is provide an overview of all the roles and really give you a formula for creating a palette, something that is transferable for any project with minimal variations. And that it can be just like your go-to way of choosing colors and applying them. And then it also wants to show you the steps for applying the palette to UI design in a methodical way rather than a random one, something that, again, you can always apply. And lastly, give a basic understanding of color terminology and theory, although I'm not going to be going into too much depth into this just because there's obviously a time limit. But I will run you through the basic bits and pieces that you need to follow along in the talk and do the practical exercise that will be at the end. Great, so the agenda, the first thing we're gonna look at is the roles of color in UI. Then we're gonna have a look at the brief. So what I mean by brief is just an invented brief, a fake brief that I've put together for the sake of the exercise that we're gonna be doing. It's basically like a client brief. And then we're going to go on to the practical exercise, which will be divided in 2 parts. So in part 1, we will be choosing the palette and putting it together. So in order to do that, we'll decide on a color combination, we'll choose our main colors, we'll choose our neutral or foundation colors, and then we will choose our system colors. And don't worry if maybe you're not too familiar with what main colors and neutral and system means, because I will run through everything as we go. And then in part 2, we'll basically be applying the palette that we put together onto a UI that I have prepared. And that will be like a live demo. And then we'll have a look at the final results of, creating the palette and applying it. And then we'll have the questions that Mariana mentioned. So with that said, before we start, I also wanted to link this article that I wrote on a guide to color in UI design. And there I go into much more depth in terms of the terminology, and some tips and tricks for creating the palette. So I recommend you read it if you haven't. But yeah, and then great. So let's start with the roles of color in UI design. So the first role we're going to talk about is color as a mood setter. And this is perhaps the role that is most commonly known, or the most popular one at least. So color psychology is basically the study of colors in relation to human behavior. And it studies the connotations and feelings that different colors provoke. So it's very important to have, as designers, a basic understanding of the psychology of colors, that we can create the correct mood and transmit the right message to our users through the interface. So I thought the easiest way to show kind of like what I mean by the positive and negative connotations is by showing you in an image, which you can see here on the right. So every color has positive and negative connotations. So for example, if we look at blue, some of the positive connotations it has, it connotates trust, loyalty, peace, calmness, stability, etc. And on the other side, so the negative connotations will be more like sadness, loneliness, rigidity, passiveness, coldness. And like I said, this applies to every color. So for example, red, the positive ones would be excitement, power, strength, love, passion, energy. And on the negative side, danger, anger, rebelliousness, violence, and warning. It's also worth noting that these positive or negative connotations on a certain color will depend on the variations of said color. So what I mean by variations is for example, if it's a tint or it's a shade. So just for those of you who might not know, a tint is basically white applied onto a base color. In a certain opacity. So it could be 90% white, it could be 20% white. And the shade is basically black applied on a base color, and same thing, it could be on varying opacity. And it will also depend on whether the saturation is high or low and so on. And another thing that is worth noting is that the emotions that colors transmit, or those connotations, will vary between different cultures. So for example, while white, just to have an example, is generally associated with positive attributes in Western culture, like purity, cleanliness, simplicity, hope, etc. It does not actually apply to certain Asian and African cultures, where this same color is actually associated with death and mourning. So we got to be aware of that. And then, this also translates to other colors, like for example, blue. In Western culture, blue is generally associated with trust, reliability, and peace. And in some South American cultures, it's actually associated with trouble. So it's definitely worth being aware of these connotations so we can transmit the right message to our audience through our UI. So the second role we're gonna be having a look at is color as a decision influencer. So visual cues are the fastest way of communication, and they're the very first thing that potential customers or users will process, and color plays a major role in this. So color can play a very important role in many sectors, and a good example is retail. So certain colors can prompt users to take certain actions within the interface. And an example of this is a red button that says sale, kind of like in this example that you have here on the screen. So red is associated with concepts like urgency and excitement, and it can be used to prompt users to take action very quickly within the interface. And another example of use of color, for example, would be a green button. So because of the meaning that green has in Western culture, it provokes feelings of calmness and a sense of going forward and growth. So choosing green for a button could indicate to the user that there is more information or more steps that need to be taken after that screen that they find themselves in. The next role we're going to have a look at is color as a guide through the UI. So by using color appropriately, you can actually guide your users through an interface by, for example, leaving some options open and closing others. And a good example of this is an active button versus a disabled one that you can see here on the screen as well. So the active button gives the user the option to take a path to another part of the interface, while the disabled one blocks or removes the option to access another area of that same interface. And obviously in this example, the role of color is allowing the user to perform an action or not, but color as navigation can take many other shapes. Like for example, when an item is selected, the color of said item might change, like you can see here on the radio button that says selected and default. So in this scenario, color enables the user to have visibility of the system status, meaning that with a change of color for a selected item, the user knows that the system has registered their choice, which is very important. And you can see this example with things like forms as well. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the using color in forms in a bit. So the next role of color within UI is color as a hierarchy creator. So first thing we're going to do is just define hierarchy very briefly. So hierarchy is defined by the specific arrangement of certain elements based on their importance, with some items being presented as above, more important, below, meaning less important, or at the same level. And hierarchy is key as it will prompt users to scan elements on the page in the order that we designers deem appropriate. And there's basically 3 approaches to creating hierarchy with color. So the first one is saturation, through saturation. So designs where there is saturation in certain elements grab the user's attention and direct it to said component. So this, you can see this in this example that I have here on screen, where all elements are black and white, they're desaturated, and only the CTA, the call to action button, has saturation in their color. In this case, it has this very saturated yellow. And of course, the hierarchy of this design could be attributed to multiple elements, like the position of things and typography, for example, and so on. But it is arguably led by the fact that the CTA jumps at us immediately for being the only element on the page that has a high saturated color. And then there's hue. So the next approach is hue, which is an exchangeable term for color. So whenever you hear me say hue, I'm saying color. So certain colors grab our attention faster or more efficiently than others. And this is the example of red, for example. So it jumps at us almost immediately. It's one of those colors that shouts at us a bit. And being aware of which colors tend to stand out more and which ones don't can also help us create the desired hierarchy on a design. And depending on the lightness or the darkness of said color, it will stand out more in one context or another, which brings me to the third approach, which is contrast. So in a design that uses a dark theme, for example, so all dark colors, independently of whether they're saturated or not, light colors will stand out much more, while darker ones will kind of blend into the background and vice versa. So the higher contrast on a component, the more prominent it will be for the user. And this is another approach we can take to creating this, this hierarchy, basically. And then the next role we have, and the last one, is color as an accessibility enabler. So accessibility is a key factor we must consider. Good or bad accessibility will basically dictate who can and cannot use our design. And we should always design with accessibility in mind so that our designs can be used by anyone. And accounting for accessibility is very important in the early stages of a product life cycle. So because colors is one of those things that when we get to designing the interface, is kind of one of those building blocks that we think about almost in the very early stages. So it's very important that we are keeping accessibility in mind and not trying to like fix it later when the whole UI is finished. And when I'm talking about accessibility here, I'm mostly referring to background to text contrast and focus states. Accessibility is a massive, massive topic, which definitely deserves a talk of its own. But in this case, I'm just talking about accessibility in relation with color, nothing else. And also something worth noting is that color should definitely not be the only way you communicate. So a good example of this is error states on forms. If you only communicate error through color, in this case red, as you see here on the right, a user with color blindness might completely miss the error and try to continue without correcting said error. So in this case, make sure you use icons or some kind of message, or ideally both, that transmits that same error information the color red is communicating. And this applies to other more complex components in the interface, like charts, graphs, label, anything that goes color coded should have an alternative way of identifying what it is or what it's communicating. However, for you to check the accessibility, the background to text contrast, there's a couple of tools that I've linked here because I find them very useful and they're kind of my go-to. So there's Class or Clues, not sure how you say that, and it's a sketch plugin. So I really recommend you get that because it's very handy for when you're designing in Sketch. You just open the plugin, select 2 layers, and it's very easy. Then there's Colorable, and it's an online tool. It's very good as well, very visual. And then there's also colorsafe.co, which is also an online tool that I'd recommend. Great. So with that said, let's move on to the practical exercise. So basically, as I mentioned before, we have a brief that has been given to us by a fake client, and it's called the Cactus Shop app. So they've given us some branding requirements, and they've said that the Cactus Shop doesn't have a defined brand yet. And the idea is that they would be able to create a mock-up of a few pages to communicate their vision of the app to potential customers and investors. And they mentioned that the vision for the app is to be modern, but with a warm, cozy, and welcoming feel. They don't want anything that is too clinical looking. And they mentioned that they like the more vintage look, but keeping that sense of modernity. And they mentioned that they're open to ideas on how the look and feel should be. However, they are sure that they want some kind of green as part of their color palette. They haven't specified what kind of green, but some kind of green. And in terms of accessibility requirements, whether the client provides these or not, you should always strive to meet the AA level of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And like I said before, the AA level depends on a lot of things like sizes and a bunch of things. But in this case, we're just going to focus in color accessibility. Great. So we're on to part one, which is basically choosing the palette. So before we go on to that, I wanted to give you a very quick introduction on the color wheel, which is going to be basically the basis with which we're going to choose these colors. So it was invented in 1666 by Isaac Newton, who was the first one to map the color spectrum into a circle. It's the basis of color theory because it shows the relationship between colors. And color theory is a practical combination of art and science that's used to determine what colors look good together. Colors that look good together are called color harmony. And you can use the color wheel to find color harmonies by using the rules of color combinations. And designers mostly use these to create a particular look and feel. And there are basically two types of color wheel. The RYB, or red, yellow, blue color wheel, which is mostly used in fashion, for example. And the RGB, or red, green, and blue color wheel, which is the one that we use in digital, which is the one that you see here on the screen on the right. Great. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is decide on a color combination type. I wanted to do this step because it's a very easy way to just select a color combination without having to like think too much about it. So there's a couple reasons why you should try to use a color combination type if you're not too sure about where to start. So first, it ensures that you use colors that work together. Second, is less time in choosing colors. And third, it's easier to justify choices to clients rather than having to say, I chose blue and green because I love blue and green. So it's a bit less subjective as well. And with that said, there's basically different types of combinations. So we have the monochromatic color combination, which is the one that you see here on the top left. And this color combination is based on using different tints and shades of a base color. So like I said before, tints are white plus a base color, and shades are black plus a base color. So that's a monochromatic color palette, and it can extend quite a bit, right, depending on the opacity that you put to those tints and those shades. And then we have the analogous color combination, which is basically colors that are next to each other or that sit next to each other in the color wheel, like you see here on the right. And then we have the complementary color combination. And in this case, it takes two colors that are opposing, that are opposed in the color wheel. Then we have the triadic one, which is basically the same as complementary. So they're opposing colors, but it takes three colors instead of two. And then finally, we have the tetradic, which is the same thing, but with four colors instead of three or two. So you might ask yourself, okay, so I have all these combinations. So which one should I go for and when? So choosing a combination will depend on a couple things. The first thing is the number of components within the interface. So for example, if you're designing a very simple interface, you might not need as many colors. But for example, if you're designing a dashboard where there's going to be charts and there's going to be quite a few things, quite a few components, and there's going to be forms and so on, then you might need more colors. Second is the purpose of the interface. So for example, in our case, our interface is the client in our fake brief, the client specified that they wanted to show this to investors. So it has to have that kind of like wow factor, if you will. And then the interface usage. So how will users interact with it? So with those three things in mind, I've chosen to go with the triadic one. So this combination, like we said, takes three colors that have equal space between each other, that they're equidistant points. And this basically provides a combination that has very high contrast and is very impactful, kind of like the complementary color combination. And it also means that it's more flexible just because you have three colors, while maybe the analogous or the monochromatic one give you a little bit less flexibility. But this is not to say that you couldn't make the exercise that we're going to do work with the complementary one. For example, of course you could make it work with the triadic as well, sorry, with the tetradic as well, and so on. But yeah, it's not set in stone. That's what I mean. Great, so now we have our color combination chosen, which is the triadic one. So now we're moving on to choosing our main colors. So in order to choose our main colors, before we do that, I wanted to take you a little bit through the anatomy of a color palette for UI. So it's a bit different than the color palette that you would do for example, branding. It has different needs. It definitely takes colors from the branding, but it's a little bit different. So you have main colors, which are primary and secondary, which are usually taken from branding guidelines. Then you have neutral or foundation colors, which I will explain in a minute, actually in this next slide, how you create these neutral or foundation colors and what they're for. And then finally, you have system colors. And these are also very important because they're going to denotate things like error states, warning states, success states. And they're usually certain colors that are associated with this, like red for error, orange for warning, green for success, and so on. So the first thing we're going to do is create our main colors. That's the thing that we're going to go for first. So we have an idea of a base color that would go well with the brand. So to get this green, I actually tried a couple other greens that you see here that I later on discarded. One, because of accessibility, they didn't meet the right AA level in terms of background to text contrast, and because of the look and feel they would create. So this one that you see here that starts with 2 zeros, this one didn't meet the AA. And actually, between this one and this one, I actually went this one because even though they said they wanted a vintage kind of feel, they still wanted it to look modern and you know, clean. So because this one is a little bit cooler than this one, I went for this one. Now, again, this is maybe one of the points where subjectivity comes to play a little bit more. So you could obviously make it work with the one in between, the one I have crossed out, because it does meet the AA level. And it's a perfectly fine color, but I personally prefer this one, and I think it's going to work a little bit better because it's not too bright, which means which is called value. So if you hear me talk about value, I'm talking about how bright or dark a color is. And so it will avoid a very clinical modern feel. So usually for example, in healthcare interfaces, we tend to see more very bright colors, very vibrant. Then, like I said, the second reason is that it passes the AA level of accessibility, which is most important. And obviously, the third and most obvious one is that it caters to the brief's requirement of using green. So this is my base because they did say that they wanted the green somewhere. So we're including in the main colors. So what we need to do now, so now we have our green, but we obviously don't know what is the triadic combination for that green, like what would it result on. So what we're gonna do is, you don't have to do it here because I've included a screenshot, but we would jump into the Canva color wheel just to get a sense of the triadic combination. So there's a lot of online tools that will tell you the triadic combinations, but I really like Canva when you want to do something just very quickly and simple. One, because it creates a basic palette rather than a finished one. Like for example, there's this tool called Colors with 2 O's. And it's great. It creates very nice color palettes, but they're not basic. They're not telling you this is a triadic combination. They're quite extensive. So I like this because it shows you exactly what would be the equivalent for the triadic combination for that base color that we have. Then the second reason why I really like Canva is because all colors are at the same level. So for example, like I was saying in the other tool that is called colors, they give you colors that are much darker, other colors that are much more vibrant, and others that are a bit more more dull. And that's okay if you're very comfortable with using colors and you can, you know what you're going to use them for. But at the moment, I wanted to create this formula so it would be a little bit easier and you wouldn't have to think about it so much. So yeah, in this case, it's great because all the colors are at the same level, meaning that they're the same amount of saturation, so like how vibrant they are, and they're at the same level in terms of value, so how light or how dark they are. They're all the same. And then another reason why Canva is very good is because you can use one color as your base, which is basically our case here. We had the green and we wanted to understand what would be the other two colors that we were missing. And it's just very simple to use. So you basically enter your base color here, and then you select your combination type from the drop down here, and it just it gives you the result, and you can export it and create graphics and so on. So it's very, very nice and simple. Great. So now we basically have our three colors: this green, this purple, and this yellowish. So the next step is going to be assigning functions to these main colors. So the two most important functions that will need to have a color assigned are the following. So elements that allow the user to move forward within the interface, like for example, call to action buttons or CTAs, and elements that reveal the visibility of the system status. So for example, selected tabs, selected navigation items, selected forms like checkboxes and radio buttons and so on. So here I've basically assigned one function to each of these colors. So green for buttons, purple for selections, and yellow for other, because right now we're not sure of what we're going to be using it for. So of course you could switch it, right, and use selections in purple, selections in green and buttons in purple. But the reason why I've chosen it to be like this is because the client said that they wanted, that green to stand out within the interface. It's something that they wanted. And there's obviously, the buttons are going to be a little bit more prominent than selections. So that's why I chose green for buttons and purple for selections. And then there's a kind of in-between step that is adjusting your colors. So we're adjusting the yellow. And although the yellow, it's exactly at the same level as the other two colors, like we talked about in saturation and value, we're going to be using the yellow in a different level within the UI hierarchy. And therefore, we can afford to tweak it to be a little lighter and less muddy or less saturated. So what I did here, you can see on the color picker in Sketch, I basically reduced the saturation, which means going left, and increase the value, which means going up. So left and up. And I'm just showing you the adjustment here, so it's a little bit lighter. So these two are going to be in the same level of importance, but this one isn't, so we can afford to tweak it. And this is perhaps the most important step when it comes to choosing your palette, which is creating your foundation colors. And this is probably the mistake that I see most often when I see interfaces, is that they've taken the branding colors and they've kind of left the neutral ones, or they took grays from the branding to create the neutral ones, but it doesn't always work because you're not going to have the branding, it's not going to have the full array of neutral foundation colors that you might need. So, so in order to create our neutrals, what I would recommend is that you create these neutrals from your main colors, because this is going to ensure that it looks cohesive, if that makes sense, that it kind of all connects. So at the moment we have three main colors. So what we're going to do is we're going to create 2 tints, 2 tones, and 1 shade. So again, tints, pure white plus color, plus color. Tones is pure gray plus color, and shades is pure black plus color. And I wanted to also point out what is a pure white and what is a pure black, right? So for that, if you see here on the color picker, here is like where the most saturated color is, right? Regardless of what color it is. And then you have all this side where it's like white at the very, very, very top left is pure white. And at the very top bottom left is pure black, and anything in between in this edge here would be pure gray. So that's what I wanted to specify that. So yeah, again, we're gonna choose 2 tints, 2 tones, and 1 shade. So you can see that here, I've basically, I have a layer of this green behind each of these blocks, and I've applied a white box on top of it, and I've set the opacity to different values. So for example, in the case of the first tint, I've applied the green plus a white at a 95% opacity. And then if you were to color sample this, it gives you that code. And same with the other ones, right? So purple plus 95% opacity, and they're all, so each row is at the same level, like we were talking about in terms of value. And same for the gray, right? So for the tones, you just choose a gray, which is what I said, in between, like in between pure white and pure black, and you set the opacity. And the increments of opacity kind of need to make sense. So you don't want to go from like something that is very light to then like a very dark tone, for example. You want to have like in between steps, but you also don't want to go, you know, crazy with the amount of steps you have, because then you're going to have so many neutrals and it's going to become very hard to manage. So this is kind of my formula. This is the way I always start with this. I decide my main colors, and then I go on Sketch and I create this for whatever main colors I have. And so far, so good. So, and you might think, okay, well, it's still a lot of neutral colors. So not all of these will be used in the UI, of course, but it's a good starting point to have an idea of the neutrals that you have available. And we will, of course, remove any unused colors later. So when you hand over this to development, you obviously are not going to include all these neutrals. We're only going to include the ones that we will use in the UI. And then the last step is choosing our system colors, which are the ones that are going to denotate things like error, warning, success, and so on. So I've kept this very nice and short because the app that we're going to be creating in the next section, it's mainly like the client asked for kind of wowing investors. So we're not going to be looking at a lot of things like forms and so on. Like, in fact, I think there's only one input field. So I didn't want to spend a lot of time designing the system colors, but usually you would just choose a red for error, a success, a green for success, and then an orange or yellow, but always keeping in mind that accessibility for warning. And also you need to make sure, in our case, for example, because our brand color is green, we got to make sure that whatever green we choose for success is different than our green, because otherwise it could get confusing. So yeah, if your brand color is red, make sure that you're choosing a red or maybe orange for error, something like that, so it's not clashing. So these ones, like I said, they're very important, but not exactly for our interface. So we will not include them in like the final palette, if that makes sense. Great. So now we're on to part 2, which is basically applying this palette that we have, which is basically this, onto a UI. And I'm going to do this live, but I think we're going to take a break before I do this. Right, Mariana?
Yeah. So what we'll do now is break out into small groups of 4 or 5. And then there will be a discussion around how would you go about applying this palette.
Yeah, exactly. I would like you to basically, if you can discuss in your groups, how would you go about, you know, what steps would you take to apply the whole palette to the interface? So let me just show you the interface so you know what we're going to be applying it to, and you can have a more productive discussion. So let me make a new share. Hold on, bear with me. Can you see an app? Yeah. Okay. So this is what we're going to be applying it to. So as you can see here, I have all the steps that we're going to go through. So I'd really like for you to discuss how you would, in what order you would apply the colors. What would you start with? That would be very good.
Great. So we have like a 5-minute discussion, and I'll break out into rooms now.
Perfect. I'll stop sharing. Am I also invited to a breakout room, Mariana?
No, I think both of us will stay in the main.
Ah, okay. So I don't click, because it says that you invited me, but
yeah. So no, don't go.
Don't go.
Hello.
Okay, you'll come back now.
Oh, right. I thought it said 60 seconds. But I think we've got, yeah, half minutes. Yeah. The only other thing I thought was that the warning and the green, the success color, they were a bit strong compared to the.
I think it got cut. Sorry, I heard something and not the rest. Something about the green. Could you repeat?
No, it's not. No, it is not. Nothing.
Oh, yeah.
Are people back? Yeah, people are back, aren't they? Yes. Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. So just great. So yeah, Carmen, over to you now again.
Sure. Okay. So this is basically the grayscale version of the UI. It's not a wireframe because there's definitely things that are not wireframe like all the shadows that are here. So it's basically like the UI in black and white. And I think if you struggle with applying color palettes, this would be a very good in-between step between obviously if the time allows for it. And the budget, but if you can, it would be a good step in between wireframes and full UI, especially if you struggle with applying colors and you always think that you don't have it nailed down. So with that said, let me go back to the presentation if I can. Oops. Can you see a green screen?
Yeah.
It says part 2. Yeah. Okay. Great. So again, with this bit, we're going to do it in steps. So the first thing you want to do when applying color is applying color to any big areas. So we're going to start with 2 bits, the background and content cards, which is a very common component in interfaces, and they actually take quite a lot of space. So in order to do that, I wonder if I do this, can you see the app or are you still seeing the steps?
I'm seeing the slides.
Okay, so then I need to, it's going to be a bit annoying because I'm going to have to be switching, but it's fine. Okay. Can you see the app now?
Yeah.
Great. So in step 1, I already have it here just so we could save a little bit of time. So you can see that this is the grayscale version. And then here we've basically applied the color to the background and the content cards. So what you want to do is basically check off any colors that you're using. So in our case, for the background, I've chosen this sort of creamy color, which is actually a tint from the original yellow. So I obviously have 3 green ticks here because the main colors are obviously going to be used. And we just want to make sure that as you go along, you're checking off these, any colors that you use. So we've used this one for the background, and you might ask, okay, so why didn't you use the purple and why didn't you use the green? You could have, and I'm sure it would work well. It's just that for the vintage look that we wanted to create, I felt like this one worked better, and it created like a warmer feel, while these ones are a little bit more cool. So yeah, I thought this one would work better. So we've checked that one off. And then obviously the content cards are white, which is missing from our palette. We usually include it at the very end, but I didn't want to add it here just because it seemed a bit of clutter. So for the content cards, the fill is white, but we've added a shadow. So if you have a look at what shadow I've added, I just want to move the video. There we go. Okay. So hold on, I'm trying to minimize the video so I can actually look at what I'm doing. There we go. So if we select the content card, the fill is white, and then we've applied a shadow with just a bit of blur and reducing the spread. So this shadow corresponds with this color here, which is actually one of our tones. for the yellow. So it makes sense that it's also yellow because you want to match whatever shadow it is. You need to cast it in the same hue as the background. Otherwise, if you put purple shadow, it would look a bit odd because the background is a tint of the yellow. So we've checked that one off as well. So now we're going to go back to our slides. If I can. Great. So we have the background and content cards applied. And this is very good because it gives you, it's like a quick win. It's like any big areas, just apply first. And then, okay, so the second part is the most important part. And it has two areas to it. So in part one of the second step, we're going to basically be applying color to buttons. Buttons are a very, very important component in interfaces. So you should be applying this next. So we're going to start with call to action or CTA buttons, and then we'll apply standard buttons. The only difference between call to action and standard is that call to actions are much more important and they're the clearest way or the clearest path forward for the user within the interface, and standard buttons are still important, but they're secondary. So it's like primary and secondary buttons. So for the call to action buttons, we're going to use our green, our brand green, and then we're going to have two shadows depending on what background they're on. So if they're on a yellow background, it makes sense we have a yellow shadow. And if they're on a white background, we're going to apply a green shadow. The reason for this is because if you put white shadows on a white background, it might look a little bit muddy. It's just a visual thing, I think. And then if you put a cool shadow, it's going to look a little bit better. So let's have a go at looking at seeing how that looks. So I'll make a new share here. Great. So we have our background and cards applied, and we're going to step 2. So here you can see that I have all the CTAs now applied in green. And all the standard buttons also applied in the right style. So, and another thing that I've treated like buttons, like standard buttons or secondary buttons, is the tabs, because they are kind of buttons, and it was just not to introduce like a different style that would be a little bit cluttered. So what we're gonna do now is check what colors we used. So obviously the green is checked already, and then we've used a green shadow for, sorry, the shadow that is in green, which is basically the shadow that these ones have, that you see here, is basically a tone of the green. And it makes sense. It's nice when you start seeing this like symmetry, right? So for our buttons, for our content cards, we had applied the yellow shadow, and we're seeing that they're at the same level. So that's quite a good sign, because they're placed on the same level. And then we've also checked out this tint of the green, because it's basically the fill that we've given standard buttons over here, and these ones don't have a shadow. So that is that. So yeah, this is perhaps the most important step, applying color to buttons. And we've got our colors checked there. So now I will change my share again and return to the slides. Great. And then, so yeah, call to action and standard buttons done. And then in the second bit, we're going to be applying color to all the rest of the interactive elements. So links, selected items, and icons with an interaction. What I mean with icons with an interaction is icons that have a function behind them. So if you tap them, they do something, right? They're not just decorative. They're not there for decorative purposes. So the first thing we're going to do is apply the green to links. So I've chosen green because links are also kind of related to buttons in a way. There's something that if you tap or you click, it's gonna take you somewhere else. So I decided to keep it in green. They could be another color, but I thought green would be appropriate. So in order to do that, I'm gonna change my share again. And go to the app. So in part 2, you can see that I have applied the green for the link. So you can see it here. I mean, we don't have a lot of links, so that's why they're very subtle. So you have the view all there, and then the different tabs I've also applied in green. So yeah, it was links. And then if we go back to the slides. we need to apply selected items. So this one is already checked. And then we're basically applying selected items, like we said on the choosing part of the presentation. We're going to have them in purple. And then we're going to have icons with an interaction in this color, which is actually, I believe, a tone of the main purple. So let's have a look at how that would look. So selected items and icons with an interaction. So icons with an interaction, for example, or selected items, here we go. This is the purple. We don't need to check it on our palette because it's one of the main colors, so it's already checked. And then we have icons with an interaction, which, for example, would also be this. The selected is just our main purple, but then we've actually added a little background here, which makes it just a little bit clearer. And we have also checked that on here. So it's this color here. It's one of the tints. And then we've also checked, it's hard to see because they're small, but we've also checked the other, the tone of the purple, which we've used for interactive icons like this one. So this one is just purple because it's selected, but these ones that are unselected, we've chosen the purple and it relates, so it makes sense. And we've checked it here. So now let's go back to the slides. Go. So all of this is done. And now we're going to basically apply color to text. And I know that we applied links and links are text, but I always like to apply links before because they're a little bit more important than the other types of text that are a bit more standard. And like I said, they're a bit more related to the button part. So here we're going to be applying all main text, placeholder text, and content separators. Now, all main text refers to, just text that doesn't have any function behind it apart from displaying content. And you really, this is a tip for UI design that I recommend you follow, is never use full black on text, because especially if it's on a white background, because it really creates like a strain on the eye for reading. So I recommend that you use like a very, very dark color. So in our case, we'll switch into the app in a moment. We've used the shade of the green. Again, you could have used the shade of the purple or the shade of the yellow, but I thought the green looked a little bit nicer and neater. So I've used the shade of the green. Then placeholder text is basically text that gives the user a hint of what they need to do. So for example, in an input field, you might have like a clue of what that input field is. So for example, like in an email, it might say email, but it's not quite as important as main text because the user hasn't actually input that value yet. And then we have content separators. The reason why I have added content separators here is because I think they're majorly overlooked. And obviously in our interface, we only have one. I'll show you in a minute because it's a very simple interface. But for example, if you have a dashboard interface where you have, I don't know, 10 tables or a lot of tables, these content separators start to add up. And I'm basically treating them here as if they were text elements, because they kind of are, right? They support the text really. So let's go ahead and do that. So all main text, placeholder text, and content separators. So I will change my share again. Okay, so I just wanted to show you what I mean by content separator. So I mean these ones here, like I said, in our case, it's just very subtle, but let's just go ahead and change step. So if I go step 3. So here, what I usually like to do is that you should have everything in style. So you definitely shouldn't go bit by bit applying color because you'll go crazy. So what I've done here is I actually have a type scale, and I'm just going to change this step by hand just to show you. So if I just select all the headings that are not white, because this is what's going to be the main text. So anything that is not white, or the links, obviously, we're selecting, except for the placeholder, because the placeholder is going to have the other color. And we're just going to grab the color picker and sample that, which is the shade for our green. And now you can see that you get an override here on Sketch. And then you just want to say update the style. And now it's loading. So yeah, and then in the meantime, you would then check the shade that you've applied. So let's go ahead and do that. So let's add the tick to our shade. And then a placeholder text, we're gonna basically, you wanna make it so that it relates to the main text, obviously, but it's less prominent. So in order to do that, I thought it would be good to have the tone of the green, because it's in the same sort of pattern, but it's a little bit lighter. So let's go ahead and do that. So on placeholder text here in our type scale, I will select this and color sample that and update it. And if I show you on the design, so now this text, I'm gonna really zoom in so you can see it. So this is actually our shade, it's not pure black. And the placeholder text that is here is now that tone of our green, which again, because it's a very simple interface, we only have one placeholder text. But again, it adds up when you have an interface with a lot of forms or a lot of content separators. And then for the content separator, we're gonna use, actually, I already have it selected. We're actually using the same color that we use for shadows, which makes sense, but this time is without blur or anything. So we already have it checked out, so we don't have to do anything there. So you can see that it's starting to like take shape, and then we'll delete anything that we're not using. So I'll switch back to the slide so we see what is our next step. So yeah, so now alt text has the right color, main text, placeholder text, and content separators. And then the last step, and perhaps the most fun one, is applying images and anything that is non-interactive icon color. So what we were talking about, interactive icons are icons that have like a function behind them. And non-interactive ones would be, for example, icons that just attempt to show information, for example. So let's go ahead and do this. So we're gonna apply some image overlays. The reason why we're applying this is so that because the client or fake client didn't really provide us with images, we wanna make it look as branded as possible. So a good way to do this is adding overlays on images, just so they have a little bit of a color, but nothing too overwhelming. And then we're gonna add icon colors, like non-interactive icons. So for that, we're gonna be using these tints, which are basically the tints for each of the brand colors. So this is the lightest green tint, the lightest purple tint, and the lightest yellow tint. And then for the icons, we're gonna be using our main yellow, and we're gonna add a icon background. So let's have a look at how that would look. I'll do a new share again. Share. So we now are going on to step 4. So you can see that that's like a big difference. So now here we have all our images applied, and you can see that this one, for example, is the green tint. This one is the purple. This one is the yellow. We've just set it to multiply. So this is not to do so much with colors, but with the treatment. So these overlays, you want to make sure you set the blending mode to multiply, because otherwise it's just going to wash off the image. While in this way, it's applying the color, but bringing in the colors of the image as well. And we just, we've set them to multiply, and no need to change the opacity because they're already very light. So what we need to do here, that actually we already had our checked color palette here, so I'm gonna grab it. There we go. Is basically check any colors that we've used in this step. So like we said, we've used all the tints, so let's go ahead and check those. So we were already using the yellow tint for the background, so that's why we had it checked. And I'm just gonna check the other two, which we hadn't used yet. So that's good. And then, like I said, we were all going to apply color to non-interactive icons. So this is what I mean, for example, by non-interactive icons. They're just adding information, but they don't really have a function behind them. So for that, we've used the yellow, the brand yellow, and then the background yellow, which I don't know if we have checked. So let me just check that. So let's see. So this one uses F3F. Yeah, so we hadn't checked that one. So that's actually one of the tints. So let's go ahead and check that one. And then, yeah, so any other icons that are not interactive, like for example, here, we also applied some colors and so on. And we already have all of these checked. They're the tints, and this is just our brand purple and our brand green. And that should be it. And the same thing for these ones. So I've just applied one of the tints following the same treatment as the overlays. So if I just go back to my slides. Great. So now we've applied all images and non-interactive icon colors. And then just to show you the results without, because Sketch is a bit fiddly. So this is how it would look with everything applied step by step. So yeah, and just as a quick recap, because I'm aware that there's a lot of steps and a lot of things to process. So in part one, we basically chose the palette and we decided on a color combination, which was the triadic one. Then we chose our main colors of that combination. Then we chose our neutral or foundation colors, which are super important because they can either make or break the interface. And we did that of the main colors. And then we chose our system colors. But like I said, I haven't put as much focus on the system colors here. And then we basically applied the palette by first applying color to any big areas like background and content cards. Second, applying color to interactive elements, especially buttons, whether they're CTAs or standard buttons, and then all the rest of the interactive elements. And then we applied color to text and other text elements like content separators. And finally, we applied color to images and non-interactive icon colors. And you really want to make sure you keep this at the end. It's very tempting to start putting images at the start. And there's very good reason for doing this at the end is because they're very visually, they might be very visually appealing and they might distract you from the actual function of the colors that you need to apply everywhere else. And also because if you work from Sketch, images make your file super heavy and it's going to start lagging very quickly. So yeah, thank you. Are there any questions?
Great, thanks so much, Carmen. So we have about like 5 minutes for some, burning questions. I know that some people are asking if we are going to share these slides on the meetup.
Yeah, we will after this.
Okay. Great, and we are also recording the talk and we're going to share on meetup. So if anyone has any questions in the next 5 minutes, please add to the chat and we'll answer them. So there's a first question. How would you color a switch on and off control in this app?
Sorry, say that again. So how do I color switch?
Yeah, a switch on off control.
Within this app, within this interface. Yeah, so that would probably fall under, so you would want to like group things in the steps that we did, right? So obviously in this case, we didn't have it wasn't a very complex interface, but that would probably go on here. So interactive elements, forms would also go in here. So in terms of how I would color it, it would be, so if we were to create a toggle, right? That's what I assume they mean by switch. The actual ball of the toggle, if we can imagine that for a minute, would be purple to the side that it gets selected. And I would probably make the text bold or something just to show that on the text as well, if it has like 2 labels on each side. And then the inside of the toggle would probably be an opacity or like a tint or a tone of the purple, because we said that purple would be for selected items. So yeah, that's how I would color it.
Great. And I'm seeing lots of comments on, thank you for the presentation. That was very useful. And you'll see the comments, after we share with you, Carmen. So we have another question. Do you have any tips for choosing colors for dashboards or data visualizations when we might have 6 or 7 colors that need to be easy to tell apart?
Yeah. So there's actually an accessibility rule that says that for dashboards where you're going to have like a lot of charts, for example, it's actually not random at all. So I think there needs to be a difference. So I think it's like 40% or something like that. So if you have a graph, for example, like a bar chart, let's just say, you can't actually pick whatever color you want. So what I would do is pick one of the combinations, one of the color combinations, perhaps the tetradic one, if you want, just because it gives you 2 colors. And then I would make shades and tints of those colors and then apply the rule, because when you have a bar chart, you can't have 2 colors. So for example, you couldn't have this green and this purple in 2 bars. So if you had 3 bars, you couldn't have the green, the purple, and the yellow. Why? Because they're at the same level of value. And that creates accessibility problems. So you would actually have to apply, for example, if you had 4 bars in a chart, you would have to apply, for example, green, our brand green, and then a tint of that green, then purple, and then a tint of the purple. So there's enough contrast between the bars. So there's a lot of accessibility rules around that for sure. But yeah, for a dashboard, the more colors you have usually, the better. And for dashboards, you can always create like a secondary palette that you use just for the charts, and then have your main palette for everything else, basically.
Great. I'm seeing a lot of questions, and I'm not sure if we're going to have time for everything, but you know, feel free to, I mean, I don't know if Carmen, if people can email you questions.
Yeah, of course. Of course.
I don't want to volunteer you. I was about to say, oh, yeah, feel free to email Carmen. But there is another question. How do you name your colors for handoff to developers? I've just hit the problem of needing darker, dark green. So thinking to switch to green 1, green 2, green 3. How do you name them?
I mean, I think if you're gonna choose between dark green and green 1 and green 2, I definitely go for green 1 and green 2, because dark green, you're gonna end up with quite a confusion there. But I think I would name them depending on what you're using them. So for example, when we use Zeppelin for dev handoff, so for example, this green that we're using for buttons, I'm not gonna call it brand green, because that doesn't really say anything to the dev team. So I would call it CTA green. So for example, going back to the other question with the charts, you might have a lot of colors. So you might just name it, I don't know, if you have all the colors for charts, like pink chart, purple chart, so they know that it's for charts, for example. So always name them with whatever function you've assigned the color in the interface.
Great. And one more question, because I don't think we're going to have time for anything else, I'm afraid. Is what if the client wants to change one color, one of the colors? Would you change the other colors to match using your original color picking method?
I mean, ideally, they wouldn't make such an outrageous request once you're done with the project, right? So if you're handing off and they decide to change the color, that might be a big thing, because then they're breaking kind of the flow. But it depends. Like they might say, oh, actually, we decided that we want I don't know, a dark pink rather than a purple, and that might be okay. So I think the answer is it depends what the change is, and it depends at what stage in the project that might be. But I guess, at the end of the day, like we have to adapt. So I would just try and make it work and advise the client on whatever is the best way forward. If it's a terrible idea, I would make sure and tell them.
Great. I think, I'm so sorry, but I think we need to stop now just because of time. But yeah, so thank you so much, Carmen, for the talk. It's the second time that I watched this talk, and I learned again, which is always very useful. And got a lot of good comments on the chat as well, which I would share with you. So I want to thank again our sponsors, Oxford Computer Consultants, Heybrook, and Fruto, and the other organizers as well, so Finola, James, and Rachel. And we are, if it's the first time that you attend UX Oxford, we run it every month, and this year is actually, it's going to be our 10th year anniversary. So hopefully later in the year, and I'm not so going to say when, but hopefully we can do a party that is actually an in-person party. But let's hope, see how the world is by then, sometime this year. But yeah, thank you so much for attending, and I'll see you next month.
Great. And yeah, any questions, please feel free to email me. I'm happy to answer them.
And are you sharing your email on the UX Oxford thing, or?
Yeah, I mean, it's carmen@frutostudio.co.uk, but I'll add them on the slides since we're going to be sharing the slides.
Okay.
Perfect. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.